Imagine confessing to a crime you absolutely didn't commit, destroying your life and freedom. But why would anyone do that? This isn't about guilt. It's about the terrifying psychological game played in interrogation rooms, where even the innocent can be coerced into admitting to the unthinkable. Prepare to discover the unsettling truth behind false confessions and how easily justice can be derailed. To understand the scale of the problem, it helps to look at what happens after the fact, when the system is forced to admit it was wrong. Over the past several decades, DNA testing has overturned hundreds of convictions that were once considered airtight. In a striking number of those cases, the original conviction rested in large part on a confession. Innocent people had stood in police stations or interrogation rooms and admitted to crimes they did not commit, sometimes in vivid detail. These were not vague or coerced statements scribbled under duress and later recanted. Many were recorded. Many were repeated multiple times. Some were even delivered calmly, as if the speaker truly believed them. The unsettling reality is that confessions, even detailed ones, can be manufactured under the right conditions. False confessions are not simply lies told to avoid trouble. They fall into distinct psychological categories, each driven by different internal and external forces. Some people confess because they see no other way out of an unbearable situation. Others confess because, over time, they become convinced that the authorities must be right and that their own memory or perception is flawed. In extreme cases, individuals come to genuinely believe they committed acts that never occurred. These outcomes are not the result of weakness or stupidity. They are the result of normal human psychology responding to abnormal pressure. The modern interrogation room is designed to feel ordinary, even neutral. A table, a few chairs, fluorescent lighting, a camera in the corner if you're lucky. But psychologically, it is a highly asymmetric environment. One side controls the space, the time, the information, and the rules. The other side is isolated, fatigued, often frightened, and almost always unprepared for what is about to happen. Interrogations can last for hours, sometimes stretching into entire days with minimal breaks. Sleep deprivation, hunger, and stress quietly erode a person's ability to think clearly long before any confession is spoken. Many of the interrogation techniques used today were developed not to discover truth, but to obtain confessions. One of the most influential methods, taught to police officers across the United States and in other countries, is commonly known as the Reid Technique. Its core assumption is simple and deeply consequential. Once an investigator believes a suspect is guilty, the goal shifts from investigation to confession. The interrogator is trained to project certainty, to close off denials, and to guide the suspect toward an admission. In this framework, resistance is not evidence of innocence. It is interpreted as further proof of guilt. The Reid technique relies heavily on psychological manipulation rather than physical coercion, which allows it to operate within the bounds of legality while still exerting immense pressure. Interrogators are encouraged to confront suspects with assertions of guilt, to interrupt denials, and to present themselves as authority figures who already know the truth. The suspect is placed in a position where continued denial feels futile. Over time, the message becomes clear. The only way this situation improves is if you confess. One of the most controversial elements of modern interrogation is the use of deception. In many jurisdictions, police are legally allowed to lie to suspects during questioning. They can claim to have evidence that does not exist. They can say a witness has identified the suspect when no such identification has occurred. They can imply that forensic tests have already confirmed guilt, even when results are inconclusive or non-existent. For someone who believes the justice system is fundamentally fair, these lies can be devastating. If the police say they have proof, many people assume it must be true. This is known as the false evidence ploy, and it is one of the most powerful tools in the interrogator's arsenal. When an innocent person is told that their fingerprints were found at the scene, or that their DNA matched evidence recovered from the victim, the ground beneath them begins to shift. They may know on some level that they did not commit the crime, but they also know they are not experts in forensic science. Faced with authoritative claims, doubt creeps in. People begin to question their own memory. They ask themselves whether they could be mistaken, whether they might have blacked out, whether something happened that they do not remember. Not everyone is equally vulnerable to these pressures. Research has consistently shown that certain populations are at much higher risk of falsely confessing. Juveniles are especially susceptible. Their brains are still developing, particularly in areas related to impulse control, long-term planning and resistance to authority. Young suspects are more likely to comply with demands, more likely to prioritize short-term relief over long-term consequences, and less likely to understand their legal rights. Many falsely confessing juveniles believe they will be allowed to go home if they just tell the interrogators what they want to hear. Individuals with intellectual disabilities or mental health conditions face similar risks. They may have difficulty understanding complex questions, may be more eager to please authority figures, or may struggle to assert themselves under pressure. Some are highly suggestible, meaning they are more likely to incorporate external information into their own memories. When interrogators repeatedly present a narrative of guilt, these individuals may adopt it, not as a strategic lie, but as a perceived reality. Even psychologically healthy adults are not immune. Extended interrogations wear people down. Stress hormones flood the body, impairing memory and judgment. Time becomes distorted. The desire for the ordeal to end can become overwhelming. In these conditions, confessing can feel like the only available escape, even if it means sacrificing the truth. This is known as a compliant false confession. The person knows they are innocent, but decides that saying otherwise is the fastest way out of an unbearable situation. More disturbing are internalized false confessions, where the suspect comes to believe they committed the crime. This can happen when interrogations are long, evidence is repeatedly fabricated or misrepresented, and the suspect lacks confidence in their own memory. Over time, the line between suggestion and recollection blurs. People begin to visualize events that never happened. They fill in details, sometimes unconsciously, drawing from information provided by the interrogators. When they eventually confess, it may sound genuine because to them it feels genuine. Interrogators often use a combination of minimization and maximization techniques to steer suspects toward confession. Maximization involves exaggerating the seriousness of the evidence and the inevitability of conviction. Suspects are told that the case against them is overwhelming, that a jury will certainly convict, that denying involvement will only make things worse. Minimization, on the other hand, involves downplaying the moral or legal severity of the crime. Interrogators may suggest that the act was an accident, a momentary lapse, or an understandable response to stress. They imply that confessing will lead to leniency or understanding, even if no explicit promises are made. This combination is particularly effective because it reframes confession as the rational choice. If conviction is inevitable and the crime is portrayed as forgivable, then admitting guilt appears to be the path of least harm. The suspect is nudged toward a narrative that reduces emotional and psychological discomfort, even if it is false. Importantly, many people do not realize that these implied promises of leniency are often meaningless. Once a confession is obtained, the dynamics change entirely. Once a confession exists, it exerts a powerful gravitational pull on the entire justice process. Investigators become more confident in their case. Prosecutors become more willing to file charges. Judges become more inclined to admit questionable evidence. Jurors, when they hear a confession, struggle to imagine how an innocent person could have said those words. This is where cognitive biases come into play, particularly confirmation bias. Once guilt is assumed, information is interpreted in a way that supports that assumption, while contradictory evidence is discounted or ignored. Tunnel vision can take hold quickly. Investigators focus on building a case that fits the confession rather than objectively assessing all possible explanations. In some cases, details from the confession are later described as having been corroborated by independent evidence, even when those details were first suggested by police. This creates the illusion of reliability. The confession appears to match the facts, when in reality the facts were shaped to match the confession. The consequences for the falsely accused are catastrophic. A false confession can lead to years or decades of incarceration, the loss of family relationships, employment, and social standing. Even after exoneration, the damage does not disappear. Many exonerees struggle with trauma, depression, and a profound mistrust of institutions. Re-entering society is often difficult, as the stigma of the accusation lingers long after legal innocence is restored. Beyond individual cases, false confessions undermine public confidence in the justice system as a whole. When innocent people are convicted, the true perpetrators remain free, potentially committing additional crimes. The system fails not just one person, but everyone it is meant to protect. Understanding how and why false confessions occur is not about excusing criminal behavior or vilifying law enforcement. It is about recognizing the limits of human psychology and the dangers of systems that prioritize closure over accuracy. As awareness of these issues has grown, so too have calls for reform. Some jurisdictions now require that entire interrogations be recorded from start to finish, providing a clearer picture of how a confession was obtained. Others have restricted the use of deceptive tactics, particularly with juveniles. There is increasing recognition of the importance of expert testimony to educate juries about the psychology of false confessions. These measures are not about weakening law enforcement. They are about strengthening the reliability of the outcomes it produces. Understanding false confessions requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about authority, compliance, and the human mind. It forces us to question long-held assumptions about guilt and innocence, and to acknowledge that sincerity is not the same as truth. In the next part, we will move deeper into the mechanics of interrogation itself, examining how specific techniques interact with cognitive biases and situational stress to produce statements that can derail lives and distort justice in ways that are often invisible until it is far too late. Inside the interrogation room, control is rarely exerted through force. It is exercised through structure: who speaks, who waits, who asks the questions, and who decides when the conversation ends are all forms of power that quietly shape the outcome. Interrogations are designed to feel conversational, but they are anything but equal exchanges. Every element, from the physical arrangement of the room to the pacing of questions, is intended to destabilize the suspect's sense of autonomy and certainty. Time is one of the most effective tools in this process. Interrogations often begin casually, with small talk and neutral questions that lower a suspect's defenses. As hours pass, the tone shifts. Breaks become less frequent. Fatigue sets in. The suspect loses track of how long they've been there and how long they've been answering the same questions. Under these conditions, the brain's capacity for critical thinking diminishes. People become more suggestible, more compliant, and more focused on immediate relief than long-term consequences. Another key feature of modern interrogation is isolation. Suspects are typically questioned alone, cut off from family, friends, or legal counsel. This isolation amplifies stress and increases reliance on the interrogator as the primary source of information and guidance. Even when suspects are informed of their right to remain silent or to request a lawyer, many do not fully understand what those rights mean in practice. Others fear that invoking them will make them appear guilty or uncooperative, reinforcing the interrogator's narrative. The psychological pressure intensifies when interrogators adopt a confrontational stance. Suspects may be told that the police already know what happened, that the only question left is why. Denials are often dismissed or interrupted, signaling that they are not acceptable responses. Over time, suspects learn that maintaining innocence leads only to more pressure, more accusations, and more time in the room. Confession, by contrast, is framed as the beginning of resolution. Deception plays a central role here, not just through false evidence ploys, but through the strategic presentation of information. Interrogators may selectively disclose details, revealing some facts while withholding others, to create the impression that the suspect's story is inconsistent or implausible. They may suggest that other suspects have already implicated the person being questioned, creating a sense of inevitability and social pressure. The message is subtle but persistent. Resistance is futile. For innocent suspects, this creates a cognitive dilemma. They know they did not commit the crime, but they are faced with what appears to be overwhelming evidence to the contrary. As the interrogation continues, their confidence in their own memory can erode. Memory is not a perfect recording device. It is reconstructive and influenced by context. Under stress, people are more likely to doubt themselves, especially when confronted by authority figures who appear certain and knowledgeable. This self-doubt is often reinforced by leading questions. Instead of asking open-ended questions, interrogators may suggest specific scenarios, details, or motives. A suspect might be asked whether they were angry when something happened, even if they have no memory of being there at all. Over time, these suggestions can begin to feel familiar, creating a false sense of recognition. When a suspect later recalls the event, they may remember the suggestion rather than an actual experience. Once a suspect begins to accept the possibility of guilt, even tentatively, the path to confession becomes much shorter. They may start to rationalize, searching for explanations that make sense of the situation. Perhaps they were drunk. Perhaps they blacked out. Perhaps they acted without realizing it. These rationalizations are often encouraged by interrogators who offer narratives that minimize moral blame while still securing an admission. This is where internalization can occur. The suspect's internal narrative shifts from "this didn't happen" to "maybe something happened that I don't remember." The line between external pressure and internal belief becomes blurred. When the suspect finally confesses, it may not feel like a lie. It may feel like an acceptance of an uncomfortable truth imposed by the surrounding circumstances. The act of confessing itself can further solidify this belief. Saying the words out loud, especially repeatedly, can change how people perceive their own experiences. Verbalization reinforces memory, even when the memory is false. Each repetition makes the story feel more real, more coherent, and more difficult to retract. This is why some false confessions grow increasingly detailed over time. The details are not evidence of truth, but of narrative construction. From the perspective of investigators, a confession is often seen as the ultimate confirmation of their suspicions. This belief is reinforced by institutional culture and incentives. Solving cases brings recognition, career advancement, and public approval. Questioning a confession, especially one obtained after significant effort, can feel like undermining one's own work. As a result, contradictory evidence may be overlooked or reinterpreted to fit the established narrative. Prosecutors, too, are influenced by confessions. A case with a confession is easier to prosecute, more likely to result in a plea bargain, and less risky to take to trial. Even when forensic evidence is weak or ambiguous, a confession can carry enormous weight. Defense attorneys face an uphill battle, convincing judges and juries that a confession was false, particularly when it appears voluntary and detailed. Jurors are especially susceptible to the power of confessions. Studies have shown that jurors place more weight on confessions than on other types of evidence, even when they are aware that the confession was obtained through coercive or deceptive means. The intuitive belief that people do not confess to crimes they didn't commit is deeply ingrained. Overcoming that belief requires not just evidence, but education about the psychological processes involved. When a confession is introduced at trial, it often becomes the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Other evidence is presented in relation to it, reinforcing its apparent validity. In some cases, forensic experts may unintentionally contribute to this reinforcement by interpreting ambiguous results in light of the confession. This is another manifestation of confirmation bias, where knowledge of a confession influences how evidence is evaluated. The ripple effects extend beyond the courtroom. Once a conviction is secured, the likelihood of revisiting the case decreases dramatically. Appeals are difficult. New evidence is hard to introduce. The system tends to treat convictions as final and confessions as conclusive. Even when doubts emerge, they are often dismissed as attempts by the convicted individual to avoid responsibility. For those who eventually achieve exoneration, the process is long and arduous. It often requires years of advocacy, new forensic testing, or the discovery of evidence that was previously ignored. During this time, the individual remains incarcerated, living with the consequences of a decision made under extreme pressure. The psychological toll can be immense, compounded by the knowledge that their own words were used to justify their suffering. The broader societal impact of false confessions is less visible but equally significant. Each wrongful conviction erodes trust in the justice system. Communities become skeptical of law enforcement. Victims are denied true closure, as the real perpetrators remain unaccounted for. Resources are wasted pursuing and defending wrongful cases instead of preventing future crimes. Recognizing these harms has led to growing interest in reforming interrogation practices. Recording interrogations in their entirety provides transparency and allows courts to assess the context in which confessions are made. Limiting the use of deception, particularly with vulnerable populations, reduces the risk of internalized false confessions. Training law enforcement in alternative interviewing techniques that prioritize information gathering over confession seeking can improve both accuracy and fairness. Equally important is educating legal professionals and the public about the realities of false confessions. Expert testimony can help juries understand how psychological pressure and cognitive bias operate. Judges can play a role by scrutinizing the circumstances under which confessions are obtained, and by excluding those that are clearly unreliable. These measures do not weaken the justice system. They make it more resilient against error. Ultimately, preventing false confessions requires a shift in mindset. It requires moving away from the assumption that confessions are inherently truthful and toward a more nuanced understanding of human behavior. It requires acknowledging that the desire for certainty and closure can sometimes lead us astray. In the next part, we will examine the long-term consequences of false confessions in greater depth, exploring how they affect not only the individuals involved, but the integrity of justice itself, and what meaningful reform might look like in practice. When a false confession enters the system, its influence does not remain confined to the interrogation room. It spreads outward, shaping every subsequent decision in ways that are often subtle but profoundly consequential. Investigators, prosecutors, judges, and jurors all interact with the confession differently, yet each interaction reinforces its perceived legitimacy. What begins as a statement made under pressure can evolve into the central pillar of an entire legal narrative. One of the most dangerous stages in this process is what is often described as corroboration. In theory, a confession should be supported by independent evidence before it is relied upon. In practice, the presence of a confession frequently reverses this logic. Instead of asking whether the evidence independently points to the suspect, investigators ask whether the evidence can be made to fit the confession. This shift is rarely conscious. It is driven by cognitive shortcuts and institutional expectations that prioritize consistency over skepticism. Details within a confession are treated as clues, even when those details were introduced by interrogators themselves. If a suspect mentions a specific location, weapon, or sequence of events, investigators may search for elements that resemble those descriptions. When something roughly aligns, it is labeled corroboration. When it does not, it is often dismissed as a minor inconsistency or attributed to faulty memory. Over time, this selective validation creates the appearance of a strong evidentiary foundation where none truly exists. This process is further complicated by the way information flows between investigators and forensic analysts. In many cases, analysts are not blind to the context of the case. They may know that a suspect has confessed. This knowledge can unconsciously influence how they interpret ambiguous results. A partial fingerprint, a mixed DNA sample, or an inconclusive tool mark comparison may be viewed as supporting evidence when framed within a confession-driven narrative. This is not fraud. It is human bias operating in a system that rarely accounts for it. Once charges are filed, the confession becomes a powerful bargaining chip. Prosecutors may use it to pressure defendants into plea deals, emphasizing the risks of going to trial with a confession on record. For innocent defendants, this presents an agonizing dilemma. Accepting a plea may result in a shorter sentence, but it requires admitting guilt and foregoing the chance of exoneration. Rejecting the plea means risking a much harsher sentence if convicted, based largely on their own words. For those who proceed to trial, the confession looms large. Defense attorneys must work against deeply ingrained assumptions held by jurors. Even when evidence of coercion or deception is presented, jurors may struggle to reconcile it with the idea that someone would falsely confess. The emotional impact of hearing a confession, especially in the defendant's own voice, can overshadow technical arguments about psychology or procedure. The narrative feels complete. The story seems to make sense. Judges, too, are influenced by confessions, particularly during pretrial proceedings. Confessions can affect decisions about bail, admissibility of evidence, and sentencing. A defendant who has confessed may be viewed as less deserving of leniency, even if there are serious questions about the confession's reliability. This creates a feedback loop in which the confession not only contributes to conviction, but also shapes the severity of punishment. When wrongful convictions based on false confessions are eventually uncovered, the aftermath reveals the full scope of the damage. Exoneration is not a simple reversal. It often requires years of legal battles, the involvement of innocence organizations, and the persistence of advocates who are willing to challenge official narratives. During this time, the wrongfully convicted person remains imprisoned, their life effectively on hold. The psychological impact of this experience is profound. Many exonerees report symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, including anxiety, depression, and difficulty trusting others. The interrogation itself, followed by years of incarceration, leaves lasting scars. Even after release, adjusting to life outside prison can be overwhelming. Technology, social norms, and personal relationships have all changed. Support systems are often weak or non-existent. Social stigma compounds these challenges. Despite legal exoneration, some people continue to view exonerees with suspicion. The original accusation, amplified by a confession, can linger in public memory long after the truth has been established. Employment opportunities may be limited, relationships strained or permanently damaged. The promise of compensation, where it exists, rarely addresses the full extent of the harm suffered. The impact extends beyond the individual to victims and their families. When a case is built on a false confession, the real perpetrator remains at large. Victims are denied true justice, and families are given a false sense of closure. In some cases, the discovery of a wrongful conviction reopens old wounds, forcing families to confront the reality that the system failed them as well. Communities, too, bear the cost. Each wrongful conviction erodes trust in law enforcement and the courts. Marginalized communities, which are disproportionately affected by aggressive interrogation tactics, may become especially distrustful. This mistrust can hinder cooperation with investigations, making it harder to solve crimes and protect public safety. The cycle perpetuates itself, fueled by suspicion and alienation. Understanding these systemic failures has prompted a re-evaluation of how interrogations are conducted and how confessions are treated. Researchers in psychology and criminology have spent decades studying the conditions under which false confessions occur. Their findings challenge many traditional assumptions about human behavior and memory. They demonstrate that confidence, detail, and repetition are not reliable indicators of truth. One of the most important insights from this research is the distinction between truth-seeking and confession-seeking approaches to interviewing. Truth-seeking methods emphasize open-ended questions, rapport building, and the collection of information without presuming guilt. They allow suspects to tell their stories in their own words and avoid confrontational tactics that can distort memory. Countries that have adopted these approaches have seen reductions in false confessions without corresponding decreases in legitimate ones. Reform efforts have also focused on protecting vulnerable populations. Special safeguards for juveniles, including mandatory presence of legal counsel or trained advocates, can reduce the risk of coercion. Limiting interrogation length and ensuring regular breaks helps mitigate fatigue and stress. Prohibiting or restricting deceptive practices, particularly those involving false evidence, addresses one of the most potent drivers of internalized false confessions. Transparency is another key element. Recording interrogations from beginning to end provides a complete record of how a confession was obtained. It allows courts, juries, and the public to evaluate not just what was said, but how it was said. Partial recordings that capture only the final confession can be misleading. stripping away the context of hours of pressure and suggestion. Education plays a critical role in sustaining these reforms. Law enforcement officers benefit from training that incorporates psychological science and emphasizes ethical interviewing practices. Legal professionals, including judges and attorneys, need a solid understanding of the dynamics of false confessions to make informed decisions. Public awareness helps challenge simplistic narratives about guilt and innocence, fostering a more nuanced conversation about justice. Despite these advances, resistance remains. Confessions are deeply embedded in legal culture as symbols of truth and accountability. Changing that perception requires confronting uncomfortable realities about authority, bias, and error. It requires acknowledging that good intentions do not guarantee good outcomes, and that systems designed by humans are vulnerable to human flaws. As we move forward, the question is not whether false confessions can occur, but how often we are willing to recognize and prevent them. The stakes are high, not just for those who are wrongfully accused, but for the credibility of the justice system itself. In the next part, we will examine the future of interrogation reform more closely, exploring what meaningful safeguards look like in practice and how societies can balance effective law enforcement with the fundamental need for truth. The future of interrogation reform is not centered on eliminating confessions, but on redefining their role within a system that values accuracy over certainty. Effective law enforcement depends on reliable information, not admissions extracted under pressure. As research continues to expose the mechanisms behind false confessions, reform efforts increasingly focus on preventing the conditions that make them likely in the first place. One of the most significant shifts in recent years has been the growing recognition that the starting assumption of guilt fundamentally alters the trajectory of an interrogation. When investigators enter a room convinced they already know the truth, every interaction becomes a means to confirm that belief. Reform-oriented models emphasize the importance of maintaining an investigative mindset, one that remains open to alternative explanations and treats the interview as a process of discovery rather than confrontation. Interviewing techniques grounded in this philosophy encourage patience and neutrality. Instead of asserting guilt, interviewers ask open-ended questions that allow suspects to provide information without fear of immediate contradiction. Rapport building replaces intimidation, not as a manipulative tactic, but as a way to facilitate communication. When people feel heard rather than cornered, they are more likely to provide accurate information, whether it implicates them or not. Another critical safeguard involves limiting the length and intensity of interrogations. Long sessions increase the risk of fatigue-induced compliance and memory distortion. Clear guidelines on maximum interrogation duration, mandatory breaks, and access to basic needs such as food and rest help preserve cognitive functioning. These measures do not hinder legitimate investigations. They reduce the likelihood of unreliable outcomes that can derail cases later. The issue of deception remains one of the most contentious areas of reform. While some argue that deceptive tactics are necessary tools, growing evidence suggests they carry disproportionate risks, especially for vulnerable populations. Restricting or prohibiting the use of false evidence ploys removes a powerful source of psychological coercion. It also reinforces the principle that truth should not be pursued through fabrication, even in the service of justice. Legal protections play an equally important role. Ensuring early and meaningful access to legal counsel can fundamentally change the dynamics of an interrogation. A lawyer's presence provides not only legal guidance, but psychological reassurance, counterbalancing the inherent power imbalance. For juveniles and individuals with cognitive impairments, additional safeguards such as trained advocates or mandatory parental involvement can prevent misunderstandings and undue pressure. Recording interrogations in their entirety has emerged as one of the most effective and widely supported reforms. Full recordings create accountability for all parties involved. They allow courts to assess whether a confession was voluntary, informed, and reliable. They also protect law enforcement officers from unfounded allegations of misconduct, creating a transparent record of professional behavior. Beyond procedural changes, cultural transformation within the justice system is essential. This includes re-evaluating how success is measured. Closing cases quickly or securing confessions should not be the primary metrics of effectiveness. Instead, accuracy, fairness, and the prevention of wrongful convictions must be central goals. Recognizing and rewarding investigative practices that uncover exculpatory evidence is just as important as celebrating solved cases. Education and training are key drivers of this cultural shift. Incorporating psychological science into law enforcement curricula helps officers understand the limitations of memory, the effects of stress, and the risks of cognitive bias. Ongoing training reinforces these principles and adapts them to evolving research. For legal professionals, continuing education on false confessions ensures that courts remain informed about best practices and emerging evidence. Public engagement also plays a role in sustaining reform. When communities understand the realities of false confessions, they are better equipped to hold institutions accountable. Media coverage that moves beyond sensationalism and explores systemic issues can contribute to a more informed public discourse. Advocacy groups, researchers, and exonerees themselves provide powerful voices that highlight the human cost of error. Balancing effective law enforcement with the protection of individual rights is not a zero-sum game. Systems that prioritize truth are ultimately more effective at identifying real perpetrators and delivering justice to victims. Reducing false confessions strengthens cases rather than weakening them, ensuring that convictions are based on reliable evidence rather than psychological pressure. The challenge lies in translating knowledge into practice. Reform is often incremental, shaped by legal precedents, political will, and institutional inertia. Progress varies across jurisdictions, creating a patchwork of standards and protections. Yet each improvement, no matter how small, contributes to a system that is less prone to catastrophic error. At its core, the issue of false confessions forces society to confront fundamental questions about trust, authority, and human vulnerability. It asks whether we are willing to accept complexity over simplicity, doubt over certainty, and patience over expedience. These choices shape not only the outcomes of individual cases, but the moral character of the justice system itself. As awareness continues to grow, the hope is that future generations will look back on past practices with a clearer understanding of their limitations. By learning from documented failures and embracing evidence-based reforms, societies can move closer to a model of justice that is both effective and humane. In the final part, we will reflect on the broader implications of false confessions, considering what they reveal about human behavior and what they demand of us as participants in and observers of the justice system. False confessions ultimately force a reckoning that goes beyond legal procedure and policy reform. They reveal something deeply uncomfortable about human behavior under pressure and about how societies construct truth. At their core, these cases demonstrate that sincerity is not a reliable indicator of accuracy, and that confidence, detail, and emotional expression can coexist with complete factual error. This realization challenges deeply held intuitions about responsibility, credibility, and moral judgment. Human beings are social creatures, shaped by authority, expectation, and the need for resolution. In high-stress environments, especially those marked by isolation and power imbalance, the drive to comply can override the drive to be accurate. This is not a flaw unique to a few individuals. It is a feature of normal cognition. The same psychological mechanisms that allow people to cooperate, trust experts, and function within social systems can, under extreme conditions, lead them to say things that are not true. False confessions also expose the fragility of memory. Popular culture often treats memory as a recording device, something that faithfully stores experiences and plays them back on demand. Decades of research have shown otherwise. Memory is reconstructive, influenced by suggestion, emotion, and context. Under repeated questioning, especially when authority figures present a consistent narrative, people can come to remember events that never happened. These memories may feel vivid and real even when they are entirely false. This has profound implications for how societies assign blame and punishment. If memory and confession can be shaped by external forces, then systems that rely heavily on these elements must be designed with extreme care. Justice cannot depend solely on what people say under pressure. It must be grounded in evidence that exists independently of persuasion, fatigue, or fear. The moral weight of false confessions extends to everyone involved, including investigators who act in good faith. Most interrogators do not intend to elicit false statements. They believe they are pursuing the truth and protecting the public. Yet, good intentions do not insulate systems from error. When methods are structured in ways that amplify bias and suppress doubt, even well-meaning actors can contribute to injustice. Acknowledging this is not an indictment of individuals, but an invitation to improve the systems they operate within. For the wrongfully accused, the experience often reshapes their understanding of authority and trust. Many describe a lasting sense of betrayal, not only by specific individuals, but by the institutions they once believed would protect them. Rebuilding trust after such an experience is difficult. It requires transparency, accountability, and often a public acknowledgement of failure. Without these elements, wounds remain open, and skepticism hardens into cynicism. False confessions also challenge society's relationship with punishment. When an innocent person is punished based on their own words, the line between accountability and cruelty becomes blurred. Punishment loses its moral grounding when it is disconnected from actual wrongdoing. Recognizing this does not diminish the suffering of victims. It underscores the importance of directing accountability toward the correct individuals. There is also a broader ethical question about how much pressure is acceptable in the pursuit of truth. Interrogation exists at the intersection of persuasion and coercion. Drawing clear boundaries is difficult but necessary. A system that tolerates deception and psychological manipulation must confront the risk that these tools will sometimes produce the appearance of truth rather than truth itself. Public awareness plays a crucial role in shaping these boundaries. As stories of wrongful convictions and false confessions become more widely known, they influence jury expectations, media narratives, and political priorities. Awareness does not guarantee reform, but it creates the conditions under which reform becomes possible. It encourages skepticism of simplistic narratives and fosters empathy for those caught in the machinery of justice. Education is a long-term safeguard. Teaching students, professionals, and the public about cognitive bias, memory fallibility, and the dynamics of authority equips them to better navigate complex situations. For jurors, this knowledge can temper the instinctive trust placed in confessions. For future investigators and lawyers, it can inform ethical decision-making and procedural design. Ultimately, confronting the reality of false confessions requires humility. It requires accepting that systems built by humans will reflect human limitations. It requires resisting the temptation to equate closure with correctness and certainty with truth. Justice, at its best, is not about eliminating doubt entirely, but about managing it responsibly. As societies continue to evolve, the hope is that lessons learned from past failures will inform future practices. Each documented false confession serves as both a warning and an opportunity. A warning about the consequences of unchecked power and unexamined assumptions, and an opportunity to build systems that are more resilient, more compassionate, and more accurate. The question that remains is not whether false confessions can be eliminated entirely, but whether their frequency and impact can be reduced through deliberate, evidence-based choices. The answer depends on collective willingness to prioritize truth over expedience, and to recognize that protecting the innocent is inseparable from holding the guilty accountable. In that balance lies the true measure of justice.